All right, folks, it is 2 p.m. and we want to respect everyone's time. And we just want to welcome you to the Gender-Based Violence Consortium's Leading Social Change to End Sexual Violence session. Super exciting. This panel is part of a symposium, which now we are in day 2 of April 16th of the Visualizing Change and Resisting Violence session. This session is being recorded, and we have some wonderful, wonderful speakers who are going to talk more about leading social change to end sexual violence. Now I would like to invite Kimberli Kocherhans, who is the founder of the Healing Center for Complex Trauma, to lead us in a grounding activity.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting on this amazing event. It's a lot of information, and it can be triggering and overwhelming, and so we'll just be here for a few minutes together. I'm going to introduce something called box breathing. It's probably something very familiar, but it's something that you can do if you're driving, or if you're here, if you're listening, if you are just having a moment where you're maybe disoriented. It helps just ground you. So I'd invite you to put your feet on the floor, both feet, and maybe your hands just loosely in your lap. Just be in a relaxed position, sitting. And the instructions are, we're going to breathe in for 4 counts, and we're going to hold for 4 counts. Breathe out for 4 counts and hold for 4 counts. For me, it's super simple. When I get anxious, I need it to be simple. So 4 is easy. So I'll kind of direct with my hands, count, and we'll do this for about a minute, not very long. And so we get started. So we'll breathe in, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Out, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3, 4. Breathe in and hold. Out and hold. In and hold. Out and hold. We'll do that 2 more times. Breathe in and hold. Out and hold. In and hold. Out and hold. All right, now we're all ready to absorb a lot more information, all right? Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. And that was so wonderful. We've had different folks who have throughout the day helped us ground before we listen, learn, be in conversation with each other. So thank you so much, Kimberli, for facilitating. Now I would like to invite Kristy Bartley to tell a little bit more about herself.
Good afternoon and welcome to everybody who's here. I'm the clinical coordinator from the Women's Resource Center here on campus. And I'm here today not only as a participant, but to help with emotional support if anyone gets triggered by any of the information that we're all going to be absorbing this afternoon. So if you would like, you can just contact me privately in the chat, or I'm also going to put my email in the chat, and I'll be monitoring my email while the presentations are going on. So thank you again for coming. This is a subject that's near and dear to the heart of the Women's Resource Center. So I hope you all have a good afternoon, and we're here to support you if you get triggered.
Thank you so much. And again, we don't know what triggers people, what impacts us. So we have resources available. We want to remind folks that you can always visit the GBVC website. There's additional resources. And if you leave us today feeling good, but maybe feel something in your body or what have you tomorrow, another day, please do reach out to the various resources available to you. Now, I am so honored to introduce to you our next moderator for this session, Dr. Yoshimi Anzai, who will serve as the moderator. She's a professor of radiology at the University of Utah and an adjunct professor of Population Health Sciences and Neurosurgery. She serves as a co-director for Women in Health, Medicine, and Science and Radiology Liaison for the Trauma Council. She has over 20 years of experience in neuroradiology and has served as a president of the ASHNR, the AUR, and the AAWR. They may have beautiful ways they say it. I hope I said them correct. And so now I'm going to go ahead and invite my colleague, Dr. Yoshimi Anzai, to take the microphone.
Thank you, Annie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's been such a wonderful gender-based violence consortium symposium. I have learned a lot of just this morning by listening. It's just the incredible depth and awareness of the work what everybody's doing. So again, congratulations to all of you. You guys really making a difference in those survivors. So thank you so much. So it is my pleasure to introduce this fantastic session of leading social changes to end sexual violence. First speaker, it is pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Kronk Warner, is the Dean of Professor of Law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. She was a formerly Associate Dean of Professor of Law at the University of Kansas School of Law, where she was also the Director of Tribal Law and Governance Centers. Dr. Kronk Warner received her JD degree from University of Michigan and also undergraduate degree from Cornell Universities. Dr. Kronk Warner is nationally recognized as the expert of the intersection of environmental and Indian law. It is such a pleasure to have her speaking in this first speaker of this session. So Dr. Kronk Warner, please take it away.
Thank you. Hello, friends. It is a privilege and an honor to be here today. I just want to start off by thanking Dr. Fukushima for having me today, and for really not just having me today, but also for being the driving force of so much wonderful change here at the University of Utah. We're so thankful for her and all she does for us in our community, of which this conference is an important part. As was mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner. My pronouns are she and hers. And as I do anytime I present, I like to start off by acknowledging that I at least am coming to you today from the Salt Lake Valley, and that the University of Utah acknowledges that this land, which is named for the Utah tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. So it seems really appropriate that we should be gathered here today on this land that was traditionally a gathering place for indigenous peoples in what is now Utah, that we should be gathering to talk about this very important topic, and one that's near and dear to my heart. So, well, I have never been in a relationship where I was physically abused. I have been in past relationships where my partner engaged in power control tactics along emotional control and financial control. So this is something that is really important to me, and I really applaud everyone for being seized on these issues. And I'm especially excited to talk about how we can be agents of change and how we can hopefully make the status quo a little bit better. And so what I want to talk today is really focus in on some exciting regulatory developments here in Utah in the legal field, specifically the Utah Regulatory Sandbox. But before I go into the sandbox, I kind of want to tee it up a little bit with my own experiences before I talk about the legal reform. So as was mentioned, I came to the University of Utah from the University of Kansas. And when I was at the University of Kansas, I was a domestic violence advocate for our local domestic violence shelter. And the advocates were not lawyers. So I had to kind of even though I am a lawyer, I had to kind of take off my lawyer hat when I was doing that work. And so we didn't technically provide legal advice, but we did help survivors of domestic violence through really whatever they needed help with. Many of them needed help navigating the legal system, but many of them also needed help just ascertaining resources and getting back on their feet after to assist survivors. And the woman who oversaw that group of advocates was perhaps one of the most impressive advocates I've ever seen, both those with JDs and those without JDs, although she had never completed and still has not completed her college degree. So it's evidence that you don't necessarily have to have a degree in formal education in order to be really good at this type of work. And that's going to become relevant when we talk about the regulatory sandbox in Utah. And she was excellent because through her lived experience, having run this program, she was really good and possessed a tremendous knowledge in a couple of important places. So for example, she taught me quite a bit about trauma-informed responses. So she taught me how survivors would respond in very different ways. So we had some survivors who extroverted in their emotions, but we had some survivors, in fact, I remember one survivor in particular who was very stoic, showed no emotion, and really learning from that experience. And it didn't mean that she had suffered any less. It just meant that her trauma-informed response was a little bit different. And so we had to respond to her in a different way. And so this woman who ran the advocacy program really taught me that, and taught me that trauma can look very different from different people. And that there's also racial pieces of it as well. We would oftentimes find that our survivors of different racial classifications and backgrounds would respond to the trauma in very different ways. And that was also an important lesson too, because not only would racialized individuals respond to trauma oftentimes different, the comfortability of having law enforcement officers, whether that's actual police come and resolve an issue, or having lawyers involved, was sometimes very uncomfortable for people in that community because of their historic negative relationship with law enforcement. So that was an important lesson as well that I was taught. She is also probably the best listener I have ever encountered in my entire life. Again, not a lawyer. And she really taught me what it means to be an active listener. And I think that's one of the skills that we don't focus on in law, to be honest, oftentimes. Sometimes students will get it in clinical education, but oftentimes we don't talk to our students about what it means to really listen. And I think in the legal sphere, there's this savior mentality that many of us have, that, you know, we're here to save the day, and that's not necessarily what's needed in these contexts. And last, one of the things when I reflect on my time with her and everything I learned from her, she was, again, despite she did not have a bachelor's degree, she didn't have a JD, didn't have a master's degree, she had a tremendous knowledge of the system, and specifically the legal system, and was able to give tremendous support to our survivors as they learn to navigate those legal systems. And that's going to become relevant to our discussion today too, because it's evidence that you don't need to have a JD to really understand these systems. And so I reflect on this experience because, of course, the broad takeaway is that you don't have to be a lawyer to be effectively good in this type of work. And she's an excellent example of that. At the same time, that at least in my personal experience, and I would say that there's been numerous scholarship written about this as well, this idea that you don't have to be a lawyer to be a very good advocate, we know that we have a huge access to justice need in the United States. And what that means is that there is a gap between the legal providers that are available and the people who need legal services. And some have estimated that that gap would be monetized at approximately $4 billion, just to give you some size of how big that gap is. And I've had it sometimes described, Justice Himonis, who is a justice on the Utah Supreme Court, oftentimes compares JDs, lawyers, to thoracic surgeons. And he said, yes, if you need thoracic surgery, it's great to have a thoracic surgeon, and that's who you want. But if you need to have a blood draw, you do not need a thoracic surgeon, and you certainly don't need to pay for a thoracic surgeon. And I think that's a really impactful, I like that he uses that analogy, because it points out that, yes, there are times when we need people who have been educated and who have JDs and perhaps can do more complex legal analysis. However, for these day-to-day access to justice needs, where some of these biggest gaps are, we don't necessarily need thoracic surgeons in order to make a difference in that gap. And it's also partially education. And this is where I think our College of Education can play a really important role as well. It's not just having legal representation, it's making sure that all members of our society have knowledge of when they have a legal problem. Oftentimes people aren't even aware that they necessarily have a legal problem and could get assistance from a lawyer or from some sort of advocate. Also, again, with this access to justice gap, another contributing factor is even in a situation where community members may be able to afford a lawyer and may have knowledge of the fact that they have a legal problem. Sometimes an obstacle, again, is the negative relationships between certain communities and members of the law field because of historic negative interactions. I mean, we only have to look at the news. Sadly, this past week has been a horrific week with another Black man being murdered. And to know that these many communities do not have comfort bringing police officers and formal legal officials into their communities because of this history of negativity and abuse. And so I think for these reasons, we can look at creatively, how can we marry these two facts? So we have individuals within our communities, and hopefully we can educate more individuals, and that's hopefully another role that the University of Utah can play. But we have individuals within the community who do not necessarily have formal legalized training, but have tremendous capacity for this type of work. And again, in my own personal experience, perhaps could even be better than lawyers at this type of work. And then on the other hand, we have this tremendous need where there are these great access to justice issues, both around education and people understanding where access to justice issues lie, and monetarily, and people not being able to afford those thoracic surgeons / lawyers. And then also concerns with having official representatives of a very flawed legal system, which many have argued is a product of systemic racism involved in their community. So what can we do to kind of marry these two things and hopefully bring it together? And this is where I'm excited about what the state of Utah, and specifically the Utah Supreme Court, has done. And I think it's potentially an area of social change that I encourage everyone to consider because I think it has a lot of value. And that is that the state of Utah is currently in the second year, I believe we just moved into the second year, of a pilot program in the legal regulatory sandbox. So here in Utah, as you know, we have a reputation for innovation, and we currently have regulatory reform in 3 spheres. So we have regulatory reform in financial technology, insurance, and then in the legal sphere. And so it's that last sphere that I want to focus on. So the Utah Supreme Court approved the creation of the Utah Regulatory Sandbox in April of 2020. It's a 2-year pilot. So again, we're through the first year and we have 1 more year. And after completion of the pilot, the Utah Supreme Court is going to do a review and determine whether or not to make the program permanent. Now, the program was really developed by 2 individuals who were co-chairs of the committee that formed the regulatory reform. One of those was Justice Dino Hermanis, who again is a justice of the Utah Supreme Court. And the other individual is John Lund, who is an attorney here in Salt Lake City, and I'm proud to say is also an alum of the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And he explains in an interview what the regulatory sandbox is and what it does. And so he said, quote, "A regulatory sandbox is a controlled environment where consumer-centered innovations can be tested and evaluated. The goal is to have legal service providers develop new offerings that the regulator can be confident will, if approved, benefit the public. The regulator calls for applications and specifies which regulations are open to being relaxed. Applicants must detail what innovations they tend to offer and how these innovations will work. Applicants must also the benefits and risks to the public of the services. Those whose applications are accepted then roll out their services to the market and collect data on their performance. At the end of the evaluation period, the regulator decides whether to approve the innovation permanently." So how is this working in the legal sphere? So in the legal sphere, there are 2 rules of professional responsibility that would typically preclude somebody like remarkable woman that I had the privilege of working with at the Willow Domestic Violence Center in Lawrence, Kansas, from doing legal representation. And that is first, that you must be a lawyer in order to conduct legal services or provide legal services. And second, that any sort of entity that is providing legal services must be owned by lawyers. And so what this legal regulatory sandbox does is allows for applicants to put in proposals that restrict or eliminate one of those two requirements. And so, for example, this work has been ongoing and has been very helpful. So specifically, the group has been looking at recommendations to the Utah Supreme Court on how reform to the regulatory structure of the legal profession can promote access to justice and provide innovative solutions to these gaps. There's a report titled Narrowing the Access to Justice Gap by Reimagining Regulation, which talks about how these existing regulations have really limited our ability to close this access to justice gap. Specifically, this narrowing the access to justice gap by reimagining regulation points out that substantially loosening restrictions on corporate practice of law, lawyer advertising, solicitation, and fee arrangements, including referrals and fee sharing, might help with this. Also, by simultaneously establishing a new regulatory body under the supervision and direction of the Supreme Court, it can implement and advance a risk-based, empirically grounded regulatory process for legal service entities offering services in a pilot regulatory sandbox structure. So what does this mean for domestic violence? It means that we can have women like that woman that I had the privilege of working with do this type of work. So there's this really incredibly innovative space now, which allows for organizations and advocates to come together to put in a proposal to the regulatory sandbox to say, we can do this work of assisting domestic violence survivors or sexual assault survivors or human trafficking survivors. We have the expertise. We are not lawyers, and you don't have to be lawyers under the regulatory sandbox. So it's possible to put in an application now and to start the work. And again, because we're in this pilot phase, there is going to be this requirement that you track your work, and basically they're going to review it after the pilot time to show that there's been no increased risk to clients than the status quo. And note that no increased risk. There is an acknowledgement that there could be some risk to providing these types of loosening of regulatory reform. So it's not without risk, but the Utah Supreme Court was willing to accept some risk. So the showing is just that you are not endangering potential clients more than currently exists. So I raise this as a potential really exciting way for advocates who are not necessarily lawyers to think about how they might come together and put in an application to really bridge this gap and to provide better services to survivors. And I'm really hopeful. We're currently at the S.J. Quinney College of Law working in collaboration with the business school on a joint clinic that would hopefully help with this work. And we're hoping to launch it in this fall of 2021. And specifically, if you have any ideas, it's something that once the clinic's launched, we'd be happy to work with you. The idea would be that the law students could provide direction on the legal aspect and the business students could provide direction on the actual business formation. So again, I think I've run out of time, and thank you very much. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warner. That's really fantastic to really empowering some educational structure the University of Utah offer to the community. So the law school students and also business school students really helping those survivors to regain the access to the regular life. So thank you so much. Congratulations for all the work you're doing. I'm going to just move on to next speaker, but please type the question you may have in the chat boxes. We'll have plenty of Q&A time at the end. So I am so honored to introduce the next speaker, Assistant Vice President of Campus Diversity and Chief Diversity Officer at the Dixie State University, Tasha Toy. She earned a Doctor of Philosophy degree in a higher education research and policy from Seton Hall University, New Jersey, and also a Master of Arts in Education and Instructional Technology and a Bachelor of Arts in History, both from North Carolina Central University. She has worked in a higher education for over 20 years in various areas, with more than 10 years really specifically focusing on diversity, inclusion, and equity. So pleasure to have you, Dr. Tasha Troy. She will be speaking. So please share your slide if you have.
No, it's just going to be me. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Because I've been having technical difficulties all day. I see head nods and yes.
Actually, and one thing I want to suggest is if folks are seeing a lag or anything, you might want to close out the many windows that we tend to have open. It slows down the bandwidth a little bit. So if you have a billion windows, you might want to shut the other ones, except this one.
You got it. Well, as was shared with you, my name is Dr. Tasha Troy. I'm the Assistant Vice President at Dixie State University. And I would just like to say thank you for the invite. My presentation is not going to be as cool as the dean's. Mine is going to be more along the lines of grassroots efforts. So I really appreciate having the time to speak with each one of you. For my perspective, what I'm going to share is that for the most part, when the work that I do really focuses on students that are on the outskirts, that are marginalized, unrepresented, and unheard. And for that reason, the group that I would like to focus on are the two that I see continually, not only on our campuses, but also in the media and also in our efforts, have been our LGBT students and our Native American students. It's very important that we take a moment and really think about what these particular environments are doing for our students, not only on campus, but always the ongoing conversation and need for them to have their needs addressed when it comes to social issues on and off our campus. I would like to share that I am a survivor of sexual assault. Not only that, but also having to come to grips with that as part of my identity. And coming to that point really happened here at Dixie State when I was confronted with it, speaking a couple of years as a sexual assault speaker. And in doing that, it really got me to start thinking about it took all this time for me to really address and come to grips and to actually speak those words about myself, what does it look like for our students? Just to give you a little bit of an overview, about 1% of our student population identifies as Native American. For our LGBT students, that is a lot less easy data to collect. Because it's an emerging group, and it's a group that we understand that is always changing. So we have not had a very good footprint or an identifier on what LGBTQ students look like at our institution. Now, please understand again that this information is not directly for DSU. But what I am talking about is what is the grassroots movement? What are some of the things that we can be doing as individuals walking across Utah to address the needs? One of the things that I have heard, not only here, but all the other places that I have lived, has been, well, that's so sad. I'll pray for them when they hear of an unfortunate event, whether it's sexual assault or, unfortunately, as we had last night, a mass shooting. But the thing that we have been moving on with DSU has been the effort that everyone has a place and a space to be either an advocate, an ally, or an agitator within that cause, within DEI. So I want to take those two things and put them together and ask you and employ you, what are you doing within the lens, within this space, to address the needs of others, those that are less heard or underrepresented when it comes to sexual assault efforts? So we're going to talk real briefly about some of the statistics and overviews of the two populations that I'm sharing with you, but also I want to walk away with some resources or some additional points that you can share with individuals or employ yourself to make a move or move the needle or bring more light to these causes. In light of the Black Lives Movement and the Me Too movement, they're really focused on individuals that are of African American or Black descent. But when it comes to Native Americans, they are 2 times more likely to be experience sexual assault crimes compared to all races. And one in three Indian women report having been raped during their lifetime. If you take in consideration that is 34% of Native women have been raped in their lifetime. But if you also take in consideration the 2010 GAO study, it also says that the U.S. attorney declined to prosecute 67% of sexual abuse, firearm violations, homicide, and things like that within the lives of Native American women. Violence against Native American women occur across the continuum, and it starts like most with verbal abuse, and sometimes, unfortunately, continue with murder. With this, like most incidents, we always hear that women are most likely, Native American women are most likely not to report their incidents. The other reason why this is coming to the forefront for us at Dixie State is because we're very close to the Paiute, I wouldn't say reservation, but to the Paiute Nation. And with that being said, we have had a couple of presenters to come on campus to give us overview about, unfortunately, the taking, unfortunately, most likely selling of or sex trafficking of Native American women. With that being to the forefront, a lot of our students have asked themselves, would that be for them? And we have continually tried to strive to give them support and to give them a voice that would not be their outcome. So some of the things that I would like to share with you when it comes to our Native American students, or when it comes to Native American individuals, is that this is not, the resources that I give you at the end are going to be centered on LGBT, but some of them also cross over to our to our Native American individuals of ability. So the next group that I would like to bring to the forefront is going to be our our LGBT students. And in doing that, again, sharing some data and some perspective when it comes to LGBT. Those are among the students that come to our area and use them. Most of them have expressed sexual assault, and it could be, unfortunately, by a family member, or it can be just because as they were living their lives of just expressing their identities. And with that being said, the National Intimate Partner in Sexual Violence Survey found that among LGBT students, 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experienced rape, physical assault, or stalking by an intimate partner, compared to 35% for straight women. 26% of gay men and 37% of bisexual men experience some type of assault. That's compared to 29% of straight men. And 46% of bisexual women have been raped, compared to 17% of straight women and 13% of lesbians. When we take in that consideration, we are only talking about lesbians and bisexual individuals. But if you take in also the intersectionality of sexual orientation and gender expression, if 53% of people of color, according to the 2015 US Transgender Survey, that are Black, said that they have experienced some type of sexual assault in their lifetime. In addition to that, the same study says that multiracial is 59%, American Indian 65%, and also when it comes to 58% of Middle Eastern individuals. But then if you want to take it and break it down into age, you can say that nearly half, which is 48% of bisexual women have been raped, who are rape survivors, experienced their first rape between the ages of 11 to 17. Now, I know I gave you a lot of data, but the reason why I'm doing that is because the facts are very clear. When students are experiencing, or when our community are experiencing these efforts or these traumas, they are asking either themselves, is it their fault, Or the other question is, who do I turn to? And that could be a friend, it could be a family member. And as previously shared by the dean, it is understanding and being that listening ear, but also understanding that there's a gap when it comes to individuals being prosecuted. So if there's a gap in those things, and they have seen it in their community, not only with gun violence, but also racial profiling in many different forms, when it comes to sexual assault, they're less likely to share that or take it or report it. So that means that they're going to be going to people that they trust that aren't within those areas to ask for guidance. And that is some of the things that I would like to share with you that are resources to combat sexual assault. Now, there is also the one group that we are partnering with a lot and giving students as a connecting has been the RAIN, which is the Rape Abuse Incest National Network. And for that organization, they really bring light to and give resources and take donations of meeting the needs of the students or the individuals, the victims, survivors, and giving them hope. So that means not only are they feeding the soul and helping them heal, but they're also giving them food and giving them access to health care. The next one is, of course, everybody knows the Human Rights Campaign, but then let's look at it a little bit closer to the Anti-Violence Project, which serves LGBTQ individuals, and it's a hotline that is bilingual, 24 hours a day. That number is 212, of course, that's in New York, 414-1124. The last part of it, of course, for us is Network Lored, which serves LGBTQ, poly, and BDSM survivors. That particular group is an emerging group, and that has been on the forefront of raising awareness and funds to help survivors. Yes, I will happily pass that last list on. The reason why, again, when we think about traditionally or the conversations that I have been privy to, really when it talks about sexual assault, they're talking about individuals that don't look like me and do not identify sexually oriented ways. But these individuals are always on the outskirt, as I shared, on the outliers and need our support. So that is why I'm using this time to share with you that sexual assault is not just with one group, it's with all individuals. And as we're moving forward, all of us can be agitators, and advocates for this cause. And that is where you come from. And I will share this list. And don't keep it to yourself. Please share with as many people as possible that what we're doing is considered, this form of outreach is considered to be grassroots effort. And that is where you can help each person overcome, or at least like me, speak the words to their survivor so they can start the healing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toy. One question. So sounds like it's terrible to hear though the victims first experiencing sexual assault in age 11 to 17. Those perpetrators that executed, prosecuted, or is that the cultural things that are somehow it's okay to assault even own daughter or a family member? So where's the legal system in that space?
Well, I would say that as Dean Warner shared, that first you have to report. And what we're noticing is a lot of individuals that are in our LGBT community are less likely to report because they are already ostracized or already feel, quote, ashamed or unworthy to have that type of support. So that is the reason why we don't see much more people actually presenting and getting into that space. But as shared, we have to get them to report. And once they report, then we can go, then the legal system can take over. But for us and what we're doing and what I'm challenging everyone to do is to encourage individuals to use these resources to feel empowered to report their cases or their incidences.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna move on to the next speaker. Pleasure to have Dr. Julie Valentine. She's the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies and Research, and as also Associate Professor in the College of Nursing at the Brigham Young University. She had extensive research expertise, including quantitative mixed method and then participatory action research. She brings a wealth of expertise in the research regarding sexual violence and a trauma-informed response, as well as forensic analysis. So pleasure to have you, Dr. Valentine.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anzai. I'm going to share my screen here. And thank you, Dean Warner and Dr. Toy. I think it's wonderful hearing these different perspectives on how we can lead social change to end sexual violence. And that really goes right into my first slide. When I consider what do we need to do to bring about this social change, we need to address this at every level. And this is everything from, as Dean Warner talked about, looking at the access to justice gap, to what Dr. Toy talked about, how do we help survivors want to report. Liliana earlier today talked about we need to do this in a survivor trauma-informed manner, letting them drive what that justice maybe means, to also engaging men. I was looking through our participant list right now, mainly females. We need to be very clear that gender-based violence is not a female issue. Gender-based violence is a cultural issue that we need to have every culture, population, gender identification, sexual orientation, race involved in this, because it cuts across all of those demographics. In fact, we know that we have some demographics, like Dr. Toy talked about, that are more vulnerable, and what can we do to help them? So I'm a researcher. So when I look at what can we do to instigate social change, which is a huge goal, I will look at it as what can we do as far as research to help drive this. A little bit of background, I am a forensic nurse. I'm a sexual assault nurse examiner, as well as being a researcher with Wasatch Forensic Nursing. And I have, or forensic nurses, and I have been working in this field for many years. I still work with patients. In fact, I'm on call today at 4 beginning. So I'm hands-on in the trenches as well as doing research. I really got involved in research because I thought that's the way to try to bring about change, to try to capture survivors' voices, aggregate those voices, and then see what we learn from our survivors through this research. So when I began to do research, I really considered my goal as developing research findings to influence practice. And I thought, practice broadly, practice everything from forensic nurse and healthcare provider practice to law enforcement, to the legal system, prosecutors, defense attorneys, to forensic scientists, to victim advocates. So I thought that's why I want to do this research, to really influence practice. Well, then I really learned that influencing practice and developing education goes so far. When we really want to look at how do we bring about social change, we have to realize that we have to influence policy, that policy is key. We can't just provide education. We can't just look at what practice changes do we need. We need to look at what is our policies, what is our legislation, what are our laws laws? And how do we use research and evidence to inform those policies and laws? And then we have social change. So this brings the chicken and the egg question. What happens first? Does policy change and then that creates social change? Or does policy lag behind and not change until we have this upsweep in social change? Now, this is something I have considered greatly in the last few months. In fact, in this legislative session, I was involved, and I have been involved for about the last 3 years with Representative Romero and other community key stakeholders in improving our consent legislation to affirmative consent. This last year, Paul Cassell, and I'm sure many of you know Paul at the University of Utah Law School. So Paul Cassell and I have worked together closely on a number of things, and we became very involved in writing consent legislation. And this year, this was House Bill 78, which is affirmative consent. Current Utah law is forcible rape is a felony 1. And then below that, the next thing is a misdemeanor, which is sexual battery. There's nothing in between. And to reach that felony 1 of forcible rape, current law is that you have to prove that a victim said no or acted negatively for having any sexual contact. So this bill would have created a 3rd-degree felony. So we didn't go from forcible rape that is very hard to prove, and we see a real low amount of prosecution in our state down to the misdemeanor. Well, it failed. I will share with you this are states that have affirmative consent or have currently evolving affirmative consent. And you've noticed we've designated Utah with that because we believe very strongly that we need to move in this direction of affirmative consent to improve our prosecution of sexual assault cases. And I'm going to give you some research findings on what are our current prosecution amounts. Now I'm going to bring up that chicken and the egg visual that I shared earlier. We had some pushback, primarily from defense attorneys on this legislation, because they said, you can't pass policy about affirmative consent because that's not the societal norm. And so we have to wait until that is a societal norm that people understand that they should engage in sexual activities when someone says yes or implies, yes, I want to engage in this sexual activity. Many of us feel that policy needs to change because we do feel in our college campuses, we're talking about consent. 2 years ago in the state of Utah, education guidelines changed, and we now talk about affirmative consent in our educational system. We do feel that we are at the point that we need our policy to reinforce this change, and that policy needs to reflect that social change and actually help to drive that social change. So that was an interesting experience looking at what comes first, policy or social change? Something for you all to think about. I'm going to quickly share some research. I have a multitude of different research projects, but I'm going to talk about 2 where we've really seen that research has helped to ignite policy changes. The first is the investigation and prosecution of sexual assault cases. We have shared this in our reasoning or to support the move towards an affirmative consent legislation, and then sexual assault kit submission rates. And I'm going to go through the numbers quickly because I have some information, more qualitative findings on why we have low investigation and prosecution, and then the sexual assault kit submission rates. So This chart shows I had done a study with the National Institute of Justice looking in Salt Lake County from 2003 to 2011 on the investigation and prosecution of sexual assault cases, and implemented what is called the NIJ SANE Toolkit. And here's our first thing that we looked at is how many cases, and these are all cases where the victim was over the age of 18, at the time they had a sexual assault examination and a fully collected sexual assault kit, they said, I want to talk to law enforcement. And these were the numbers. We found that out of those that had fully collected sexual assault kits, said, I want to talk to law enforcement over the age of 18, that 34% of those cases were screened by law enforcement with prosecutors, meaning that 2/3 of the cases ended at law enforcement. So I recently re-implemented, and this is a published study, but we recently re-implemented this study, and this is in the process of being published, our new findings. So for Salt Lake County, what we found is, boy, not much difference. We were hoping that we would find a significant difference on the percentage of cases that were screened or referred. And I also did this study in Utah County for the first time. And you can see we even had a lower percentage of cases that were screened. So these were 73% in Utah County of the cases ended at law enforcement. So we then looked at why. Why did cases not move on from law enforcement to the prosecutor's office? And you can see these findings, and I think these are something that we really need to dig into, because this represents where we are socially on these issues. So you can see uncooperative victim was the #1 reason in Salt Lake County. We certainly could spend hours talking about what that means. Victim did not want to pursue prosecution. I've been talking with Yukasa and Liliana on this. What do we do to help support our survivors in moving through the criminal justice system? Why is it that we have a number of survivors that have a fully collected sexual assault exam, say, yes, I want to prosecute this case, and then say, I'm done, I don't want to do this anymore? Now you can see in Utah County, the #1 reason why a case was not referred for prosecution was a belief by law enforcement of lack of evidence or unfounded. We can spend a lot of time talking about that as well. You can see that was almost 4 times more in that jurisdiction than in Salt Lake County. So then we want to look at the prosecution rates. So you can see in the earlier study, we found that out of those cases, again, all fully collected sexual assault kits, the victims said that they wanted to prosecute. 6% were prosecuted in the cases 2003 to 2011. We had improvement in Salt Lake County. Now, I showed you the earlier slide about law enforcement screening those cases. The improvement did not come from law enforcement screening more cases. The improvement came from the Salt Lake County DA's office. They're prosecuting more cases, which is wonderful. And then you can see Utah County, even though there was a lower amount of cases screened, they did have a higher prosecution. These cases that are not yet adjudicated, many of those are cases of sexual assault kits that were previously not tested and have now been tested, and they have reopened those cases, the Saki and Danny cases, which is great to see. So we shared these with many communities, this low prosecution numbers with many community partners as we tried to push for this affirmative consent legislation to say, we need to make a change. We need to find ways to increase this prosecution. So then also I wanted to share a little bit about sexual assault kit submission rates. A study that I did looking at 2010 through 2014, you can see the numbers there. These were all fully collected sexual assault kits. We found only 38% of those kits were submitted. I'm going to catch you up to where we are now. But first, we wanted to look at why some kits were submitted and some weren't. The number one reason is the location of the rape. We found that we had one county where only 4% of the sexual assault kits were submitted, up to a neighboring county, it was 40%. So that just shows the subjectivity of the decision to submit a sexual assault kit or not. Then we found that male victims were more likely to have their kits submitted. When I talked to some law enforcement about this finding, they shared, well, I think there's some thinking that if a male victim reported this and went through the exam, might be more likely to believe them. Suspected drug facilitated were more likely to report, less likely to report the victim used drugs, which might mean they are less credible. They bathed or showered. Victims with physical and mental impairment. Other studies have shown that they're often seen as less credible. And then if it was a known suspect. So I just want to quickly show you, here's our graph. So that research on looking at sexual assault kit submission rates led to House Bill 200 passage in 2017. And that mandated the submission and testing of all sexual assault kits. And you can see on this graph, this was before House Bill 200 took effect, that law enforcement really responded and submitted these kits, which is wonderful. But when we compare the prosecution of cases, you can see there is a widening gap. So then we have to look at how do we drive that social change to increase the prosecution. We are submitting more of these kits. So I'm just going to end with one of my favorite quotes. And I want to thank you all for being here because you are part of this small group of thoughtful, committed citizens that can change the world. Margaret Mead said, indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So we have a lot of work to do. We have made progress, but it really is all of us working together, working to represent and bring all voices to the table that we can really drive this social change. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Valentine. This is fantastic work. It's a lot of food for thought in your presentations, chicken or egg. What do you think about outside of Utah? There are the social media, Me Too movement, Harvey Weinstein, many other very powerful men are now prosecuted. Is this just a sort of like a power dynamics, or maybe women were now willing to speak up, or maybe that's not happening in the state of Utah? What are your take on this?
I think that we still have very low reporting rates, which was kind of in my cloud there. So I think it's creating an environment where women feel that they will be believed and that they will feel supported in coming forward to report. And we do have a number of high profile cases, but when you look at those high profile cases, they also involve, for the most part, high profile women. Where I don't think the Me Too movement has even touched are those women survivors that might be assaulted by the manager where they work or something, and they're a single mom. The Me Too movement is not empowering them to come forward because they are still dealing with so many issues and often feel that they won't be believed because they are not a high profile survivor. So we're making progress. Still a lot more progress to make.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Definitely, there's a track to the law enforcement. I think that's another piece is that many people, victims, are afraid of calling law enforcement. I think previous speaker also talked about the sort of previous past negative experience, maybe influencing on that. So a lot of question, more thought to think about. Okay, so I'd like to move on to next speaker. Thank you so much. Next speaker is Dr. Kozue Akibayashi. It's my pleasure to introduce this speaker. She is a feminist, a peace activist, a researcher focusing on ending sexual violences and militarism in Okinawa. She's a professor of graduate school of global study in Doshisha University in Kyoto, Japan. And she's actually speaking from Japan. We are in the morning. Thank you so much. She has conducted a research on Okinawa Women Act Against the Military Violences, a feminist peace movement in Okinawa, Japan. She is the president of a Women International League for Peace and Freedom and a member of International Women Network Against the Militarism and a Korea Peace Now. She is also the recent publication extensively published in this space, including Cold War Shadow of Japan, Imperial Legacy for Women in East Asia, as well as Okinawa Women Act Against the Military Violences, an Island of Feminism Reclaiming Dignity. So it's my pleasure to have Dr. Kozue Akibayashi. Welcome from Japan.
Thank you very much for having me. It is an honor to be included in this very important symposium. I am in Japan at 6 a.m. and I've not been able to join other sessions. I only joined now. I already started to learn a lot, but I might have missed the previous discussions that took place earlier, and I realized that I'm going to start my PowerPoint. And I'm hoping my presentation today on sexual violence and militarism can contribute to deepen the analysis and structural understanding of sexual violence towards ending sexual violence. My colleagues and I believe that it's important to understand sexual violence in the context of militarism, and that's what I am going to discuss today. I have well, let me show where Okinawa is, and this is a larger map, and I hope you can see. I try to point Utah, and you can see how far we are. I'm in Japan, mainland Japan. I am from mainland Metro Tokyo area, ethnic mainland Japanese, which is different from Okinawans. And you can see I hope you can see where Okinawa is, and I'm going to show a larger map of Okinawa in relation to mainland Japan and other neighboring countries in Asia. And this is where the U.S. military, on the islands of Okinawa, this is where the U.S. military has been stationed since 1945 in a very concentrated manner than other places in Japan. You can see how close Okinawa, the islands of Okinawa, is to other major cities in Asia, and that is the very reason, geopolitical, so to speak, rationale of high concentration of U.S. military in Okinawa. A little more the population and land area and so forth. I'm also showing the map of the main island of Okinawa, which only consists of about under 1% of the entire land area of Japan. The population-wise is similar, but you can also see that almost about 70% of the the U.S. military forces stationed in Japan is located in Okinawa. The colored area on the map shows the military facilities that takes up about 15% of the main island land area, main Okinawan island land area, where the population is about 1.5 million, and the U.S. military, this is a rough number, all forces are there, 4 of them, Air Force, Navy, Army, and the Marine Corps. And the rough number is that the number of troops is about 26,000, and out of that, 15,000 is Marine Corps, which is the largest stationed outside the United States. And there are civilian workers and family members. The U.S. military does not release those numbers, and they have become even more secretive in recent years. So it's very difficult for us activists, researchers, but also local authorities of Okinawan prefectural government, for example, to have these numbers. A little bit of the colonial history of Okinawa and the Ryukyus. I'm showing the castle, which is a replica of the Ryukyu kingdom. Okinawa was an independent kingdom of the Ryukyus until 1879, when Japan centralized modern nation of Japan, annexed or colonized the Ryukyu kingdom and turned into Okinawan prefecture. It's one of the 47. It's a prefecture has much less autonomy than statehood in the United States, but it's one of the it's one of the political administrative unit, and there are 47 of them in Japan, and Okinawa is one of them. So the independent kingdom was turned into one of those 47 prefectures in Japan in 1879. And during that course, very strict assimilation policies were imposed on them, the restriction of their language, the prohibition of the usage of their own languages, and many cultural practices. And they were, the Ryukyu kingdom had much wider relationship, amicable relationship with other neighboring countries in Asia, including China, and Korean Peninsula, and down to what is now the Philippines, and their wider relationship with other countries is reflected on the structure of this castle, which is called Shuri Castle, which was actually burnt down during the World War II. Because of this colonial history, Okinawa also went through a very militarized history as well. During the World War II in the Asia Pacific theater between 1931 and 1945, the people of Okinawa experienced the direct combat on their island in 1945, a very short period of time, but that caused devastating effects, to say the least, on the people of Okinawa, because the ground battle was waged with the civilian Okinawans resided there. They were not evacuated, so they were evacuated from the island. It's said that about 1/3 of residents were killed in this battle of Okinawa, which lasted only for 3 months or so, or 3 months or so, until the end of the official defeat of until the official end of the war, but the actual combat prolonged even beyond that surrender of the of Japan to allied nations. Okinawan people also went through very different history than mainland Japan vis-a-vis post-war period. Between 1945 to 1972, the U.S. military directly occupied Japan, Okinawa, whereas the rest of Japan went independent in 1952. It was until 1972 that Okinawa, the Okinawa prefecture, was reverted to Japanese administration. I'm showing some pictures of the Battle of Okinawa, and also the time the time when they were the Okinawans who survived the Battle of Okinawa were relocated to different to camps when the U.S. military started to build the bases when Okinawans were kept on the relocation camp of 30-some locations for 2-3 years. And the picture picture is also showing, one of the pictures showing the one of the major bases, Marine Corps airfield of Denma, and you can see how close people live with this airfield, and that's a result of the post-war so-called reconstruction led by the U.S. military. Their history is also militarized and militarized. The history of sexual violence is also militarized and colonialized one. Okinawans, I'm listing two major aspects of militarized sexual violence experienced by Okinawans. Is one of them, the earlier one, is so-called conflict stations, established by the Japanese imperial military during World War II. And the conflict stations is a military sexual slavery, where women and girls were kept to serve the military. In this case, it was the Japanese military. The Okinawan women who were already working in prostitution were sent to conflict stations established in different locations in Okinawa. And also under colonial rule of Japan, the women and girls on the Korean Peninsula also brought to these conflict stations in Okinawa. So when the World War II ended, the sexual violence by the U.S. military started in 1945. There are cases which I will detail a little more later. Sexual crimes committed by soldiers stationed in Okinawa. It started when the U.S. military landed during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, and actually in April 1945. And when war ended, it was a part of the post-conflict reconstruction that sex industries were established, and Okinawa was also used as the destination of rest and recreation that for U.S. soldiers who were deployed in different regions to participate in the wars that the U.S. military waged in other Asian countries and beyond. That includes Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth.
Kozue, 1 minute left.
Oh, so I'm going to very quickly. I'm introducing Okinawa women act against military violence and long-term military stationing and sexual violence there. And their analysis, the analysis and understanding is that militarism and sexual violence reinforce each other. And about social change that we are talking about, ending sexual violence, their argument is that we need to address the problem of militarism, which is an ideology that places first priority to militaristic values. That means it's an ideology that sanctions of use of the coercive force for protection. And this notion of protection is also is a very gendered process, as I think we are also aware of. And sexual violence as a domination and demonstration of power, and it's also exercising force, is accepted in a society where militarism constitutes the core values of that, and sexual violence is an intrinsic part of the military. I'm finishing with this one. I hope. One of the activities is making sexual violence visible and compiling chronology of sexual crimes committed by U.S. military personnel, and trying to fill the gap between official statistics and reality. I think that was also discussed earlier. I think I'm sorry, this is going to be my last slide. I have another one, but my time management, because of my time management. This is one of their very recent activity to remember victims of sexual violence by U.S. soldiers. This is one of the hundreds of cases for the past 70 years, and this one is the last week they have this memorial gathering in Okinawa of the victim who was killed by a sailor 2 years ago. She was sexually assaulted and killed by her former boyfriend, and she had a military protective order, but he was able to leave the base, and this happened not on the base. This happened outside the base, and this shows this shows many aspects of the problem of long-term military stationing in place like Okinawa, which is not in armed conflict situation, but directly affected by armed conflict. And this is something that I wanted to share with you about a part of the U.S. culture and policies that has impacts outside the country, and I was hoping to bring this the concept of militarism in understanding the structure of sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Yes, no, thank you. Wonderful.